Welcome one. Welcome all to the Politics of Cinema. On this show, we believe that films are cultural artifacts. There's a political as well as artistic message captured, accidentally, sometimes on purpose, in every film. We are on the lookout for all of it. My name is Aaron Spears.
And my name is Isaac Miller. And on this episode, we're doing a deep dive on Sergio Corbucci's masterful spaghetti western, The Great Silence.
That is true. This is one of those... I think this movie is an example of a lot of stuff on purpose and maybe a few things by accident. So we've got a little bit of both on this particular film.
I mean, I think this is one of these, just like our last deep dive, Uptight, this is one of the reasons this podcast exists, right?
Yeah.
And I think maybe not all this is intentional, but a huge amount of it is. Its political context is deep and important. And it's... should we just very quickly say, for anybody in the audience who hasn't listened to this podcast what is a spaghetti western?
Oh, is that a question for me?
Yeah, why not?
It is now that I think about it, it's kind of fairly culturally insensitive of a term, because it's westerns made in Italy, hence the spaghetti part, during the mainly 60s and also into the 70s, but I think it came about in the 60s. They shoot them real fast. They've got plenty of the landscapes that look like the American Old West, and can be dubbed in multiple languages and shipped out and make a buck on, grisly action, a bit of violence, and a lot of Western tropes that were dying off in America. It saved the Western genre from my perspective, because the Westerns that you're getting in the mid to late 60s were and coming out of Hollywood.
And, so much of what's interesting about them is that they refract the most American genre, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through an Italian lens. I think there is, this is one of the special features, I think, on A Fistful of Dollars. I mean, we've talked about spaghetti westerns during our 60s series last summer.
That's your cue to drink every time you reference that 60s series.
Well, it's going to keep happening.
Yeah. Well, they're good. Go listen to them.
Yeah, right. They're really good.
Yeah.
I mean, we've never even matched that level since. It's been pretty depressing.
It's not video, but I'm patting my back right now. You can't see it, but I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm. It was really something to be proud of. Okay. No, but they tend to be darker and more violent, and in some ways reflecting, directors that grew up under fascism and World War II in a way that Americans might not have. And, the most famous director of this genre, who's considered one of the great directors, I think, of all time, right, is Sergio Leone.
Yeah.
We're talking about Sergio Corbucci, who is the second best Sergio.
Of the three?
Of the three, what is it? Sergio
Somolina? Yeah.
Somolina is the last one. But yeah, so just thought it was worth it just to lay out just that little bit of context there. Like, we're talking about a very specific kind of genre here.
Right. Which is one of the things we love on the show too, is like, you got the genre of the westerns, but then you got spaghetti westerns within that, and then in some future episodes, I'm sure we'll talk about, within spaghetti westerns, you have the Zapata westerns that are only exclusively looking at, through a Western lens, the Mexican Revolution. And I'm sure there may be even some more subgenres there too, but that's for another podcast. As we do with our deep dive episodes, obviously it was going to be spoiler filled, because we're taking a deep dive into a particular film. I don't know exactly when the spoilers will come up, but if you've not seen The Great Silence, as of this recording, it is available on YouTube. If you have a library card, you can go to Kanopy and register and watch it for free. You could also get the amazing, spectacular looking Blu-ray that has been put out in the last few years. If you're a fan of physical media like us, that is the way to go. So you can watch it no matter what condition you're in. But also the deep dive episodes, we do a little bit of personal context. We do some film synopsis. We do some items of note from the production itself, people in front of the camera, people behind the camera. We do the film analysis that we usually do on the show, even when it's not a deep dive. And then we also take a look at what happened when the movie came out, or in this case, didn't come out, at least in the United States of America. So The Great Silence, 1968, we said Sergio Corbucci. He is also the co-writer along with 5 other people, including his brother. It is not one of those mess of a scripts, though. Usually when you have that many writers, you're like, oh, God, what happened here? You had to call in all these extra writers. It is so co-written and directed by Corbucci, prolific director. He did several movies. He was doing several movies a year for a while, and we'll get to the other 1968 movie he did here in a little bit. But personal context, Isaac, how did you find this movie? Because I found the movie because you found it. So really, you're the origin story here.
Well, I don't remember. So
Okay, on to the next topic.
no. I don't remember actually where I first heard about it. I think, it had a revival when it was restored,
Yeah.
right? A lot of people had
Yep.
seen it in an English language version that looked like shit.
Hmm.
And, it was restored and they showed it at the Cleveland Cinematheque. And I don't remember why this was so important to me to see this. I think I'd read about it,
Okay.
and I read about it as a very political film.
And that was all you needed.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I had to see that. So I went and saw it, and it just blew my mind.
Wait a minute. I don't think I knew this part. So you did see it on the big screen.
Yeah, I've seen it on the big screen.
Oh, sorry, that's my jealous noise. Yeah, there was a North American theatrical run, 2017-18, which it must have been when the Cinematheque programmed it. So
Hmm.
I have no problem crediting the Cinematheque. They deserve all the credit in the world. It's an amazing cinema institution here in Cleveland. But yeah, that seems to be when it popped up, at least on the film critic circles that I follow. And I was just like, oh, everybody's talking about this. I knew it was heavily influence. It was a heavy influence on Tarantino making The Hateful Eight. So I knew that title was popping up around then, and then I was working with you shortly after that, and you were like, "You've never seen it?" So you'd obviously seen it at that point, and you were telling me that you were buying the Blu-ray, and I was like, "Oh, I need to watch this." Then you were like, "Of course you do. It's on YouTube right now." So that was my first introduction, which is definitely not the best way to have an introduction to a movie, but I have a decent sized projector and screen I built in my basement here. So like it was washed out and looked kind of like shit, but it was still like, it's still that powerful. You're just like, okay, I need to own a copy of this. I need to watch this in a better format.
Yeah, I mean right. Like it's. I mean, just the well, we're going to talk about the visuals in a moment. I mean, this is a Western in the snow, which is
Right.
also a particular Western subgenre, you could sort of say.
Oh, you're right. Subgenre. Nice.
It's right.
We're
I
already
mean,
there.
there's a direct line from what Day of the Outlaw by De Toth to
Hmm.
10 years later, this one to The Hateful Eight.
Right.
But it's yeah, no, I just it just got in there, and then I'd really only seen I was spaghetti westerns. I'd really only seen Sergio Leone ones. I hadn't really dug into the deep dive stuff,
Right.
and this was just like oh, and it's so different, and it's so well. We're gonna jump into all this. It's
Well, let's get for people that haven't seen it, I guess, for one, you should probably just stop this one right now and go watch it. But if you're sticking around, for those of you sticking around, the basic synopsis, just so everybody's on the same page of what we're talking about here, you've got the hero as a mute gunfighter named Silence, appropriately, he can't speak. He arrives in Snow Hill and is hired by a local woman, Pauline, to kill the bounty hunter who shot and killed her husband. Depending on which version you're watching, the bounty hunter played by Klaus Kinski is either Loco or Tigrero.
I in Italian they're saying Tagrero.
Right.
In the subtitles they're saying Loco.
Loco. So I went with Loco in my notes because I had subtitles on, and that's how I was watching it. So Loco was shot and killed her husband because there was a bounty on his head. He's a bounty hunter. Bounty hunters have been hired by Polycott. He is a local banker slash store owner slash justice of the peace slash scourge of the town. He's the one putting the bounties on people's heads.
Well, part of it is he controls the local economy, right?
Right.
And so basically he's forcing people into stealing or not even stealing just to get revenge. I mean, and I think in this case it's that he wants to sleep with Pauline. So
Well, in that particular case, it is, yeah. But there's been a severe blizzard and snowstorm, and that has caused it seems like it's caused some shortages, but he's placing bounties on just the townspeople's head. He's now calling them rebels, and by placing the bounties on the head, he's attracting bounty hunters to come in, and it's terrorizing the town, but it's how he exerts control over the population of this small town anyway. So yeah, the townspeople, they've been declared criminals technically by the state, which is essentially Polycott. There's also no sheriff in town just yet, which we'll get to in a moment. So he's pretty much got an iron grip on this town, which in the movie seems to consist of like his general store, the brothel, and that's about it.
right, there's some houses you see a few other people at some point or another,
Yeah.
but there's not a lot. I mean, so part of it is like, I mean, we actually start with, yeah, you have all these sort of bandits or outlaws up in the hills who are trying to hold out, and I think the other part of the context that is really important is, so like he's got getting bounty hunters to hunt them down. They are waiting up the hills because they're expecting an amnesty from the new governor.
Right.
And Silence is just going around, well, getting revenge for people.
Which is sort of a different version of a bounty hunter. It's interesting that it really kind of blurs the line a little bit because everybody has their own code. Not everybody, sorry. Loco and Silence both have their own kind of codes of conduct while they're conducting their business. Silence will not draw first. He will only shoot in self-defense, but he's particularly talented, well, at drawing very quickly, but he's particularly talented at riling people up that he wants to kill and then therefore killing them legally because they were about to kill him. And Loco, Klaus Kinski's character, he only goes after people who have a bounty on their head, so he is able to lawfully kill, and he doesn't wait for them to draw, he'll just kill them. But
Well,
legally, because the law has put a price on their head.
well, this is just to hint at some of the themes we'll get into. So much of this movie is about the law and the limits of the
Yeah,
law and how the law is used for justice and injustice.
right.
But we should probably continue with the synopsis. Sorry.
Well, that sets up the two-way climax. Well, actually, it's not even a two-way climax because we have a sheriff here as well. We have Sheriff Burnett who comes into town. So you have a town that doesn't have a sheriff. Sheriff is now introduced to this equation. So you have your antagonist, you have your protagonist, then you also have the sheriff in the mix here. So it's kind of an interesting three-way power struggle of is the law going to be able to take hold and what will that look like within this town? But it also sets you up for your kind of classic Western climax, but with a twist, because this is a subversive Western, which we'll get into those details in a little bit. Of your showdown, you got Silence, and you've got Loco and the bounty hunters, and the showdown in the middle of Snow Hill, right outside the brothel saloon, in the snowy streets, in the bitter cold, and here's where the spoiler 3, 2, 1 countdown goes. Our hero does not make it out alive. This is only the bad guys make it out alive here. Townsfolk, you know, Silence, Pauline, the woman he was there to seek vengeance for, none of them make it out alive. It's a bloodbath. It's a massacre. We get a little bit of a coda, which we'll talk about, and right to credits. It is bleak.
It's devastating, and it's not even just that everybody dies; it's how they die.
Mm-hmm.
It's the sheer we'll talk about it more.
It's the sheer you're right. So let's get into a little bit of what went into the making of this movie. Should we just start with the director? I mean, we're kind of fairly auteur based around here. This is a Corbucci film. Unlike we'll just say like the main Sergio Leone, I think you've mentioned before on the show, Isaac, that if you go through his filmography, like you can kind of argue, I mean, he only did like 7-8 films, I think, total, and you can kind of argue masterpiece for any given one of them to a certain extent.
I mean, I think they range from like an extraordinary movie to masterpieces, and there's like half of them are masterpieces.
Right. Like it's a really great batting average.
Right.
And I'm not diminishing Corbucci at all. I've actually enjoyed a lot, even some of like Corbucci's like odder, weirder offerings. But Corbucci was prolific. He wrote 38 movies and directed 63. And his career as a director spans from 51 to 91. So that's an intense run of just constant production. In the time period that he was directing, he started off in what are called like sword and sandals films that were coming out of Italy at the time. They were cheapy, kind of low budget, like Hercules movies. There's a bunch of these. And one of the ones that he did that I went back and watched was it's got a great title. It was like it's Goliath and the Vampires. They're pretty terrible for the most part. They're like grainy watches on Amazon Prime or on YouTube, but they're interesting just because like the director and you know what he would go on to do, so it gives it an extra little like added novelty to it. And some of the worst ones are just incompetently directed. I mean, they're just awful. Like you can tell with him, he has some story beats and he's got a decent visual flair for it, and he can set tone and pace, but they're not like forgotten masterpieces. They're kind of just the stepping stones to get where he would eventually get to. This one in particular that we're looking at today is part of what he did called a Mud and Blood trilogy. I think you've seen all three of these, Isaac. You've got Django in 66, Great Silence in 68, and The Specialist in 69.
I actually have never seen The Specialist.
Oh, okay, so we're in the same boat then. I've seen Django and Great Silence. And Mud and Blood definitely works for Django. I feel like it's more like Snow and Blood for Great Silence.
Yeah. So, like we're saying, this is in the snow. It was shot in the Alps?
Oh, that's a good question. I did read some production stuff where they used a lot of like shaving cream for snow
Sure.
and some other stuff where you're just like, God, what a fucking mess.
But it looks amazing.
Oh, it looks amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this is, this is, I mean, Django is a movie we talked about once again in our summer of the '60s a fair amount, actually. I think
Hmm.
we covered it. It's very good and quite influential.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think, we said this, what's interesting about this one, and I think the other movie to compare it to, and I definitely want to talk about this, is The Mercenary, which is another spaghetti western he did that year with Franco Nero,
Yeah.
which who also starred in Django, but didn't star in this.
But was offered the part. I think it was like a schedule conflict or something. So we almost had a Franco Nero in this one.
I mean, I think this worked out. I mean, I love Franco Nero, right? He's
Yeah,
incredible,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
think this actually
It
worked
worked out
out very
just
well.
fine. Yeah.
But I think what's interesting to me is, so I also like Hellblazers a lot. I mean, these are very good movies. They're
Hmm.
great movies. None of them are close to this.
Right.
Like, this is almost an anomaly. It's so good. I mean, this is. I think we were talking about this earlier. Is this the greatest spaghetti western? I mean, the only thing I think that it's very debatable. I mean, I think The Good and the Bad, the Ugly, and that's it.
I think like I told you before we were recording, I think this one may edge it out for me just because I love sort of like the set in the snow.
Yeah.
Um yeah, like I think the setting really just like really enhanced it for me. And it's just like, okay, that just tips it right over the top. Also I like the bleakness of it, and I like what he's doing with some social and political metaphors that we'll get into when we get to that port of the discussion here. But yeah, it's also just such an interesting tonal shift for him because like Django's actually probably pretty close because that one does feel it says down and dirty, it says violent. It doesn't quite have like as bleak of an ending, but there's moments you're just like, oh Jesus, I can't believe they went there. Well, it's not as bleak because Django's still around, but it's close. But also for '66, watching Django, you're like, I can't believe like movies that were coming out in America, at least even the other spaghetti westerns, weren't quite going to that territory in '66. And luckily, that found quite a bit of financial success as well. So I think that allowed him to really. I think he pushed the envelope even a little bit more with The Great Silence after doing Django.
I mean, he didn't just push the envelope. He like tore up the envelope and set it on fire.
Well, okay, so but part of that could it be because it's set in the snow? So like the shock of blood, like even the opening sequence when you see Silence just ride in and he takes out some bounty hunters that are trying to kill him, it's limbs shut off, it's headshots, but blood in the snow is such a more popping visual than just blood in the mud that you get it with Django. So yeah, it's I mean I don't want to like bog it down with like which one's more bloody or anything like that. But so in this era, or for this show, I was looking more deeply at Corbucci's career, and I was like, well, there's 63 movies. I'm not gonna be able to watch all of these, but I tried to watch a few more leading up to The Great Silence that I wanted to see. But then also I watched a few that were like later in his career, and I had never looked that far before. He's got a series of movies he did with Bud Spencer and Terrence Hill, who can be hilarious together. I'll say that. I watched Who Finds a Treasure Finds a Friend from the '80s. He also did Odds and Evens. He has a bunch of them where like he's got like Miami-based comedies called like Super Fuzz with Ernest Borgnine, and like it's a really erratic career that's really fascinating. I didn't get a chance to see all of those, but it's almost like he said a bunch of stuff in Miami that were hit comedies in the Italian film market, which is like kind of the format for spaghetti westerns, just reversed. And I don't know that he actually came to Miami to shoot. I didn't look into that part, but it's it's really interesting. Almost like he found a good format with the spaghetti westerns, and then did that for Italian comedies that he would do later in his career into the '80s.
Huh.
It's pretty wild. You mentioned The Mercenary just a moment ago from '60, the other movie from '68. Did you want to dig in anything kind of like tonally with The Mercenary versus Great Silence here?
I don't know. I was sort of holding back until we sort of really jumped into the content, because I actually think
Okay.
I think it's really important to compare them, especially
Okay.
politically. I mean, the other thing about Corbucci, like so many of these directors, is he's a leftist, right?
Yeah.
And those commitments are there in this movie. They're also very much in The Mercenary, which is one of your Zapata westerns, right? It is set during the Mexican Revolution.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, they could not be more different tonally. And yet I actually think that they're playing with some of the same themes around sort of the commercialization and capitalization of everything.
Hmm.
One, The Mercenary is about the commercialization of revolution, and in the end they sort of overcome that, right? and revolution is revolution,
Yeah.
despite money making off it. And the other one, The Great Silence, is about the commercialization of human bodies and corpses, and you don't.
Yeah, that's true. Also in The Mercenary you get a great Jack Palance with the curliest hair I've ever seen him have. In
I
fact,
mean,
his nickname in the movie is Curly, which is hilarious because that's his name later on when he would do City Slickers.
I mean that is a wig, right?
I
Like,
don't know. It's gorgeous, whatever it is, but it looks like a wig to me. But I don't know what Jack Palance's hair history really is. So I'm not sure. So I did notice that this applies to The Mercenary. Watching some of the comedies, even of the era in the late 60s and 70s that Corbucci did, when he leans more into comedy in his screenplays and his movies and his stories, he tends to tone down the violence. And I don't know
mm,
if maybe there was just so much violence in The Great Silence. He was like, okay, I fucking need a break. Okay, let's ease up here in The Mercenary. But there's gunfights galore. There's plenty of weaponry. There's plenty of shooting. There's grenades. It's nuts. But at the same time, there's just you don't see the result of that violence. You don't see like the limbs blown off. You don't see the headshots. You don't see the blood splatter everywhere in the mud and the blood and everything else. In fact, it's rated PG-13, so like it's more your typical late '60s Western violence from a Hollywood perspective, almost.
The Mercenary is about a Polish mercenary contractor who ends up being hired by a bunch of Mexican rebels during the Mexican Civil War, who are basically functionally bandits, and basically is their military counselor,
Right.
and is doing all these things for money, and yet they're building up a relationship, and there's the tensions through that. And meanwhile, the revolutionary who starts as sort of an apolitical bandit eventually is able to find his way through the love of a good woman, as well as the advice of his Polish mercenary, to actually being a revolutionary. And then things come to blows between them. I mean, but ultimately, there is like this whole theme of the commercial, the basically the capitalization of war, right?
Yeah.
And of revolution, and what is revolution. And it ends with both friendship and revolution triumphing.
Yeah.
So if you made this violence that over the top and you made this that vicious, it wouldn't work, because this is actually an upbeat movie.
Yeah. Well, as
Um,
I'm saying, I think he was smart enough to kind of tonally know, like, okay, I'm not going to go that far with this on this one because here's the essence of the plot I'm going for here. Where, like, as you said, when you have a movie in The Great Silence where it's like literally the commodity of corpses, it's got to be that rough and that violent.
I mean, the violence in the Great Silence, though, it's not. There's a lot of sadism, but it's not the sadism of, let's say, a Sergio Leone movie where it just seems like people are cackling and then kicking people.
That's true. That's true.
That's because the people laying out that sadism are these
Hmm.
bounty killers, right? And they're doing it for the money.
Right.
And they're doing it all, quote, according to the law.
According to the law. Right. Right. Right.
And what? It's a different kind of evil.
That's true.
It's it's
That's
it's
true.
might it's might makes right splice through bureaucracy. It's really, I don't know.
Yeah. It's disconcerting and gross, but in a different way. One other thing I noticed, like taking a deep dive, but like an extended look at Eric Corbucci's career and some of the themes and some of his characterizations, because he did again, like wrote 38, directed 63, so he's a writer director. He's got a movie called Minnesota Joe in 64 about a blind gunfighter. Then you've got Django who drags around a coffin. It's like and then you've got Great Silence. You've got a mute gunfighter. It's interesting. He has these interesting kind of hooks that he works with to like give the protagonist, sorry, like an interesting kind of standout characteristic. They're not just like another gunfight. Like you know what I mean? Like there's almost like
Mm.
it's an interesting narrative hook he gives some of these. Like it there's also almost a parallel with some of the Shaw Brothers, some of the samurai films coming out where like, oh, it's the one armed swordsman, or like, or it's the blind sword. Like those are tropes that are already kind of floating around in other genres. So I was wondering how much he was like inspired by that, or was just like, oh, it'd be interesting for this. What if the lead? Oh, well, I know in The Great Silence, it was like, well, he doesn't have a great command of the language we need him to speak, so we'll just make him mute. We have a
Right.
French actor here, so we'll make him mute. But it's like, you know what? It works. It's a really interesting really interesting kind of narrative trick here for or character trick, I guess. And Minnesota Joe, the blind gunfighter, that's kind of interesting. Like I'd be curious to see like, wait, how's he gonna be a gunfighter? Like it gives you something else to play with, I guess, as you're working through your narrative.
I mean, part of it is it does, and of course with this movie it fits so perfectly. I mean, this is a movie with these great vistas of isolating snow, right?
Hmm.
Like this is what makes it so different than any other spaghetti western I've seen, which is it's quiet and contemplative. And
That's
having
true.
your
Yeah.
main character literally not be able to speak
Right.
really adds to that, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
you just got these long shots, these long distance shots of just deep isolation.
Yeah.
And I think everything fits together, right?
Yeah. 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 So we need to get into a few other folks that are working with Corbucci on this one, and I put at the top of the list Vanetta McGee because she just came up on a previous episode, one of our watch challenge episodes, because you watched Thomasine and Bushrod, in which she co-starred in '74, and so it was like, oh well, then we need to take a look at what else she's done. Because as we mentioned on that show, it was like, oh, she was also in Blackula, she was also in Detroit 9000, and so it was like, oh, she was popping up in a lot of blaxploitation films in the early '70s. Well, then it turns out that this is her first feature film role. It was her first acting job.
Wild.
It is pretty wild. Now, technically, it's one of those. If you look at her filmography, she had made an Italian romantic comedy called Faustina that actually came out first because of just the logistics of how films get edited and come out. So she started off at San Francisco State College as a pre-law student. She drops out, and then she head to Italy to Cinecittà to find acting work, which was like I didn't know that was an option in the late '60s. Luckily, she did because we got a bunch of great performances here. So she did Great Silence, first feature film work with Corbucci with this entire cast, amazing work. And we'll kind of get into that when we get through the movie itself, like kind of how interesting and subversive that ended up being. But then Sidney Poitier, of all people, was supposedly to have invited her, as it was put when I was reading an article about her biography, invited her back to America to act. And so he got her back to America to co-star with him in The Lost Man in 1969, which was a Sidney Poitier vehicle about black militants robbing a bank to finance their revolution, which sounds like the plot that we just did our last deep dive on, Uptight from 1968, which is interesting. Which is actually it's a movie based on Odd Man Out by Carol Reed, so it's like inspired by something else. But again, Uptight was inspired by it was inspired by a
Right.
novel, but then
Right.
also it was inspired by The Informant, the early John Ford movie.
You know what Odd Man Out is about?
I haven't seen it. It was British, so I assumed you have.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, Carol Reed is,
Yeah.
and no, it's about IRA. It's about someone from the IRA running for it.
Oh, just like The Informant.
Well, I mean, it's a very different story than The Informant. It's not about a traitor or whatever. But yes, both of these are movies about black militants in which the original story they're basing it off of is set in Ireland with the
Ireland.
IRA.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Well, we'll
What
have
an
to.
odd little sub genre trend in the late '60s.
What is happening? You feel like there can't not be something going on, but I don't know.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. So yeah, so she worked with The Lost Man, which it was written and directed by Robert Allen Arthur, who also did a bunch of plays. Anyway, like he's got an interesting political history to go into, but that's too much of a tangent to go into now. But if you want to look him up, very interesting stuff. She goes on to star, or not star, but she goes on to. Here's what I wanted to contrast with this. She goes to Italy first to find work and does. She gets Great Silence and Faustina, Italian romantic comedy where she plays the daughter of a World War II GI and an Italian woman, and she's trying to decide between two suitors. So you have an Italian romantic comedy starring a black woman in 1968. Role that she was not going to be getting in Hollywood anytime in that time period, which is kind of interesting politically, but also, how the different industries work between two different countries there. She comes back to America. Sidney Poitier is apparently at his invitation. She's in The Lost Man. Then she gets a role in The Kremlin Letter, which I have not seen, but on IMDb, her character is billed as the black girl. And I feel like that couldn't be more of a contrast between what you're getting in Italy as far as roles go and then what you're getting in Hollywood when you come back here.
Mm-hmm.
So in '72, she heads back to Italy, and there's a movie which is a great pun called The Big Bust Out, which is the interesting trend, which I will dive into at some point because I've only watched a couple of them. It's one of the women in prison films that were popular in the late 60s and 70s, but this was an Italian-made production, women in prison film called The Big Bust Out. Haha, what a pun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then she, I don't know if you want to say hits her stride, but she definitely hits it in 72 with Melinda, Blaxploitation, Blackula, Blaxploitation, Hammer, another Blaxploitation film. And then in 73, she does Shaft in Africa, clearly, part of the Shaft series, and Detroit 9000, Blaxploitation. And then 74, she does Thomasina Bushrod.
I mean, so she's doing that. I mean, I know some of her later roles. I mean, she's in Charles Burnett's, Charles Burnett's To Sleep with Anger. She's in Repo Man, which may not be a coincidence because Alex Cox is a foremost expert on spaghetti westerns and a massive fan of
Oh, yeah,
this
yeah.
movie.
No, I mean, he said like he cast her in that because he's a great Silence fan.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there we go. So like she does some interesting things after the sort of blaxploitation period as well.
Right, but it seems like that was it's interesting to see how she went back and forth with like Italian stuff, then came back here, then went back to Italy for one movie, then came back, and you have the blaxploitation boom. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'll get some work here. Yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. It came up on our previous Watch Challenge episode. And I was like, okay, that she's worth. Let's dive in here and see what's going on. Because also once we get to the film, like she's an integral part of the movie, and I put in my notes like she's the narrative engine that makes this movie exist. The Great Silence. So it's very interesting. We also have the man playing Silence, the Great Silence himself. I'm going to try this French pronunciation. Jean-Louis Trintignant.
Trintignant.
I'll say Jean-Louis. I know I got that part down. He's in The Great Silence in 68. Speaking of politics of cinema and future episodes at some point, Z, 1969.
The Conformist, speaking of movies that we're really going to have to cover.
Yeah. And then I put in there, because it was a Michael Haneke film that I adore, Amour from 2012, but it was obviously much later in his career. He plays the older man. Well, I don't want to spoil anything with that movie, but of the elderly couple that movie's about, he's the elder man in that one. And I thought he was worth mentioning here as we're going through some of the pre-production because he had mandatory military service, and that took him to Algiers in the late 50s and early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he got some political ideas in his head by having to serve compulsory service there.
In a brutal colonial war? I don't know, because he does seem to, like, you look at that early career stuff, it's The Great Silence, Z, The Conformist, one after another.
He's attracted to certain stories, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm a little presumption there. I didn't read that from a biography, but either way, I was like, well, that's worth noting. Let's put a pin in that. And then, of course, we can't move on to the film itself without mentioning Tigrero/Loco Klaus Kinski.
In what is probably one of his early, really prominent roles.
That's a good question because, I mean, spoiler alert for how the movie, ended up showing, it didn't get a theatrical release in America. So it didn't help him at all in America for American audiences.
Right.
But this is also hooking up with Werner Herzog as well. Like
right.
he actually moved to Italy in the 60s, late 60s, and was working almost exclusively in spaghetti westerns before hooking up with Herzog. So I don't know. Kinski is a whole big fucking can of worms to open up to start talking about. But should we do a little bit of a little biography of Kinski, like leading up to 68 at least, before we jump in?
Yeah. Sure. I guess we could. I guess we could. Could you just say why he's a can of worms, real quick? Just you shouldn't leave that hanging there.
Well, he's a maniac and alleged, sexual predator, and there's, a lot of skeletons in his closet. But for the sake of talking about this particular movie at this particular point in time, I thought it was interesting that his biography getting him into the movie industry was, he was conscripted at 17 into the German military during, World War II and that period in German military history. And there was a quote that was like, it's pretty much like, I don't know if it's really fact. It was reported on more as like, here's the story of his war experience as he has rewritten it.
Mm-hmm.
So he says that he made a conscious decision to desert. He'd been captured by the Germans, court-martialed as a deserter, sentenced to death. He escapes, hides in the woods. British patrol opens fire on him. He's wounded in the arm. They take him as a captive. He's being treated for his injuries and interrogated. Kinski's transferred to a prison of war camp in Britain. The ship transporting him is torpedoed by a German U-boat, but is able to still arrive somewhat safely. You can't really be that safe if you've been, torpedoed by a U-boat. So he's held at the prisoner of war camp 186 in Colchester in Essex. There, he starts doing acting roles in prison on stage, taking parts in variety shows intended to maintain morale amongst the prisoners. So it's like that is a fucking really circuitous, effed up way to like get to performing. By May 45, at the end of the war in Europe, the German POWs were anxious to return home. Kinski heard that sick prisoners would be returning first, so he tried to qualify by standing outside naked at night, drinking his own urine and eating cigarettes, trying to make himself sick. That sounds like the most Kinski thing, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
that's the most realistic thing in this whole story.
fucking nuts. I have no idea what if that's true. I mean, I imagine probably the U-boat stuff is verifiable. I heard that as like I saw that in an article as an anecdote, and I was like, that is too juicy to pass up. That sounds like a Herzog movie.
Right.
And I don't know why. Maybe it is. Maybe it's one I haven't seen. But I was like, what the fuck? That is nuts. So, war is over. He gets into acting, post drinking urine, post eating cigarettes, possibly still standing outside naked at night. Who knows? He's a nut job. And he ends up working in spaghetti westerns. Corbucci casts him as Loco slash Tigrero. And we get the usual weird ass Kinski role that we get in this movie.
I mean, what we get is maybe the greatest villain in the whole genre. I think one of the greatest villains I've ever seen
Yeah, I'm with you on that
in
one.
a movie.
Yeah.
Like there is a coldness, but also there is the things that he's doing with the tone of this character and what the character stands for is absolutely astounding.
Well, that feels like a pretty good behind the scenes summary. The different individuals, the different artists that are going into the movie to make the movie behind the camera, mostly in front of the camera. I guess we were kind of actor heavy on this one, but there's interesting backgrounds there that I think are worth noting before we jump into this film. The only thing I had in my notes to mention before we dive into the politics and the kind of the world that this movie is operating within is Corbucci, as a co-writer and director, went into this and is on the record going into this movie. He conceived it as a politically charged allegory. Was I think it was his widow described it that way after he had passed away. He went into it as a politically charged allegory inspired by the deaths of Che Guevara and Malcolm X. And I didn't know that until watching it for the second time.
Okay, but it made sense, right?
Right, yeah. So I was just like, oh, let me keep that in mind. Now, also, just to note too, 1968 is a banner year for revolutions, uprisings, whatever you want to call them. There's actually a book that Mark Klansky wrote called 1968. That's I would highly recommend it. That goes through like Berlin, Mexico City, Chicago, Prague, Paris, London. Like it was an intense year, and that's the environment that he's going into production on this particular movie in.
I mean, it's the year of the Tet Offensive, like or
Oh
you know
shit, yeah, that's right.
it's one of the most significant years of the 20th century in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That sort of shapes the trajectory to go forward, and it's not surprising that yes, these tied together. We already mentioned the mercenary and we compared. I'm going to keep bringing it back in because
Hmm.
the contrast between revolutionary hope and revolutionary despair in these movies is, considering they're both from '68, is
Yeah,
kind of, yeah,
yeah. He made his own like yin and yang kind of spaghetti westerns here.
basically.
Yeah. God, that would be an exhausting double feature, though.
Oh, which would you watch first?
That's the question. I would want to end with the Great Silence, I think, because I'm one of those like everybody's dead, fuck it, kind of like that's the end of the movie, kind of vibe I go for. But
Hmm.
that's just me.
Well, the other thing is, so you've got this, and then you've got movies. If you think about, significant movies of that year, right? You've got Night of the Living Dead, which ends with what? Your main character dead.
Yeah, it does.
You got Easy Rider,
Well, the next
uh,
year, but yeah, all dead.
the next year, which
Uh huh.
Uptight, which nobody noticed, but we noticed, and we did a big thing on it. Once again, your main character is dead.
Dead.
One
Yeah.
gets the sense of a certain degree of general revolutionary despair by this point, that the hope of the 60s is starting to wane, or what have you. But shit's rough.
To say the least. Yeah.
But I have to say, as devastating as both Night of the Living Dead and Easy Rider is, I don't think they hold a candle to the end of this movie.
Yeah, I had that in my notes too, where I was like, but why does The Great Silence seem so much more bleak? Like those are bleak endings. Like Night of the Living Dead, revolutionary film as far as and we'll jump into George Romero at some point in life of this podcast, but like Easy Rider, revolutionary film for other reasons. Again, self plug. See our summer '60s episodes on that. But like this ending is so much more bleak. And I don't know if we want to get into the ending right now, but I mean we're kind of bringing it up. But like, what makes it so much more bleak?
I mean, I think first off, it's the expectations of the genre. I think it's the snow. I think it's the darkness. I think it's the sheer cruelty of villains who, yes, are sadistic and don't care, but are not like your Sergio Leone villains. They do this for the money. They do this. It's the
Right.
coldest, hardest calculations, right? Of
Hmm.
that the commoditization of human corpses, right? That's the
Right.
capitalism of this film. Like, yes, they serve Polycott or they work for Polycott, who also
Yeah.
dies during this movie. But even once he's gone, they keep harvesting corpses and and using the law to harvest
Right.
corpses for money. And to see something like that so cruelly, I mean, like, part of it is it's not just that there's a showdown and he loses, it's that he loses horribly, right? Like, because by this point, we'll just say it, right? Because we're talking about the end.
Yeah.
Um, his hands have been devastated, right? He's been injured repeatedly. And so part of the thing to remember about both Django and A Fistful of Dollars is they're both remakes of Yojimbo,
Oh, that's true.
of
Yeah.
of Kurosawa's Yojimbo. And in
Yeah.
Yojimbo and all of them, the hero gets injured, pulls it back together, and kills
Right.
off all the bad guys. And in this, that just doesn't happen because it's not possible.
That's where the bleakness came in for me. And I didn't really realize it till going through it like the second, third time or whatever it was. But there's no hope going into the final shootout here.
Yeah.
He like both he's not a lefty, but that hand gets fucked up. His right hand's been burned. It's there's zero hope going into the end. So it's not of how are they going to get out of this one. It's like he cannot get out of this one, and it's like it's so fatalistic. And then like the note I put in my notes was like, oh, you have this ending. You have good characters that are entirely powerless against the unstoppable evil capitalists.
Hmm.
And I think that's why the bleakness just hits so hard in this one.
And the second part about it, and this is where I think dealing with people who are leftists who grew up during World War II and with fascism,
Hmm.
right, is that it ends with a massacre. Because so the bandits or the outlaws who are really just mainly innocent people or been people who've been driven to it have come back to the town because the sheriff, and we're going to get into the sheriff's dynamics. We're sort of going to be going backwards, I guess, because we just decided to jump to the big
Yeah, we're doing
end.
this memento style, I think, where the ending was first.
Sorry,
That's all right.
but you shouldn't be listening if you haven't watched this anyway. But like, the sheriff basically has insisted that they be allowed to be back into the town. We'll give them food. The amnesty is coming. Like, the reign of terror is going to end legally.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
That's the idea, and the sheer ineffectualness of this all, right? Because everything that the villains do, not everything they do. Some of the things they do are illegal, but by and large, they do things that are not against the law, and it's the law and the law straining against itself. But basically, they've come back with the
Uh-huh.
hope of everything being over, and instead they're captured because no one good is left, right, to protect them except for injured silence. And it basically just ends with them screaming for their lives as they're just massacred. And
Right.
it invokes the experience of World War II. It invokes the mass murder of the Nazis or Italian fascism. Like, that's the thing about it. Is
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
this is, and part of one of the things that occurred to me is like, this is an allegory for capitalism is weird because the actual capitalist is Polycut and he dies, and the ultimate villains are these mercenaries who are capitalists with human corpses. But like, they're not like whatever. But if it doesn't feel, as archetypal if you're deconstructing capitalism in this film. But if you're talking about revolutionary despair, which is what this movie is about, if it's about Malcolm
Yeah.
X or what have you, and you've grown up or experienced the real violence of, fascism, um,
Hmm.
might makes right. A form of capitalism in which mass murder is part of its process is what in a sense what you relate to and what you're sort of envisioning here.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. Is it? Yeah, it's this. It is just this overwhelming horror, and and then when you have Vanetta McGee's character, who doesn't have to die, but she runs and she tries to, and then she's shot, and there's just no one. There's literally no one. Even the madam, who's a sympathetic character, is it
Oh,
ends up
Regina.
getting
Yeah,
shot.
yeah.
Regina gets shot. Like it's
Yep.
just and all of it legal.
That's the thing that really hit me this time through, because like I was so used to some of the tropes of the Western genre in general, and specifically spaghetti westerns too, that it. I don't think it was till you pointed out to me. You were like, I think almost all but one of these murders is legal by what by the law within this world. It's like, oh shit, that's really gross. But you're right.
And it's repeated over and over again. I mean, the thing that Loco Tegrero, he frames himself when he's going after the bandits or whatever. And I remember this from there's a scene where the Sheriff Burnett, is coming into town, and he's in the same carriage as
Oh, Silence and Loco. Yeah.
Loco, right? So they're all together. This is when they meet.
It's I in my notes I wrote this. This is the Hateful Eight scene.
It's totally the Hateful Eight scene,
Yeah.
right? And but part of it is like Loco lays out the facade of a philosophy that he has, right? He's these are people who are against God and man. These are these people that he's hunting down. He's doing good for society by murdering them in cold blood. Like, yes, I could take them alive, but they shouldn't be.
Hmm.
And then later on, as he dispatches the sheriff, who is taking him to jail in another town,
Yeah.
um, he basically, which is maybe one of two, maybe illegal murders that he carries out after murdering, I don't know, half a dozen people in the movie at least,
Yeah.
is, it's about might makes right. And the law, he uses the law as a tool, right?
Right.
All of them do. Polycott is the justice of the peace, and he is the state
Yes.
in that context. It's just, yeah.
Well, also too, when Loco Tegrero, he doesn't actually kill the sheriff by shooting him. He shoots the ice under him, and then he falls into a lake. So he's even saying technically, oh, I didn't kill him. The ice water is going to take care of him.
Right.
Again, that's just a check mark in the category of that's an awesome movie villain.
He's so calculating and so smart and so quiet and controlled.
Hmm. It's infuriating to watch.
He's an infuriating character
Yeah.
because, and it's not that he's always ahead of things. So basically, Vanetta, he murders Vanetta McGee's character, or I mean, husband.
Husband. Yeah.
And this is where this is the first scene where sort of race comes into it, right? Because he complains after murdering him by pointing, what is the world coming to when a black man is worth more than a white one?
Yep. Exact quote.
But so Silence basically, Vanessa McGee's character hires Silence, and Silence tries his usual stick where you try to goad him. You try to goad the bounty killer into trying to shoot him, and then Silence is faster and he always wins. So you can just kill him
Hmm.
legally, and basically, it doesn't work because he doesn't pull out his gun. He literally puts his gun on the table, gives it to one of his friends, and then starts punching Silence instead.
Oh, I beats the shit out of him. Yeah. Well,
And
because when they arrive in town, because they're all on the same stage together, stagecoach, the three, and they arrive in town, and immediately Polycott is trying to get Loco Tegrero to off Silence, and he mentions his MO of like, oh, he'll try to get you to draw first, and Loco, I'd say to his credit, but fuck that guy, he's evil mastermind. He's just like, oh, I can keep my temper. Don't worry about that.
yeah,
So
I
he
don't
he
I don't
he
need to do
knows he knows the game that Silence is going to play, which immediately puts him at an advantage.
And actually, part of what actually ends up in that scene is he does eventually Silence actually knocks him out of the bar, and he does reach for his gun, and it's actually only the intervention of Sheriff Burnett that keeps him
Right.
alive. Oh, what did I say? The one point where he loses control is that point because
It is that point. Yeah.
Burnett puts him in jail
Yep.
because Burnett has been sent there by the governor to clean things up in advance of a pardon, in advance of the law changing, to
Right,
sort
when
of
the
get
amnesty
this
comes for everybody. Yeah.
right. But like part of it is this is that, here this is the so we're seeing the cruelty of the law, the way the law serves capitalism, the way the law serves the powerful and violence. And Burnett is the other side of the law, which is supposed to, protect justice and life. But he's actually a good gunfighter, and he's not 100% incompetent. Everybody who says he's bumbling, but he's basically bumbling and ineffectual and totally ultimately out of his depth.
Yeah, that was interesting because that came up in like the descriptions when I was looking at like, Rotten Tomatoes and Wikipedia. Like he's characterized as like a bumbling sheriff, and I was like, I don't think that's true in this movie. There's maybe a hint of that here and there, but he's coming into a situation that is kind of untenable to a certain extent for him. And then also it's just an awesome narrative that he arrives in a stagecoach with like the protagonist and the antagonist at the same time. It just doesn't know it. But he's fairly shrewd at a few points.
Yeah, I mean he is fairly shrewd at a few points. I think that's the problem is that he's a little bumbly. He's kind of a goofy guy, but he is a dangerous shot. Like the thing is this, it's not none of the bounty killers are going to take him on directly. One, and this is what's really different than a lot of us spaghetti westerns is nobody's willing to break the law in this openly.
Yes, yeah. That's true.
And because there are actual consequences and because they're all operating within the law. The bounty killers make their money within the law. If they broke the
Right,
law, they wouldn't be able to make their money anymore. And they make
right,
way more money murdering people um, legally. So they're not going to do that. But he's also like, he's a pretty deadly guy. And he exercises his power. He does constrain them. But ultimately, Tigrero Loco is smarter.
right. Yeah, he just out manipulates him, which is so. There's a thing with the. I think there's an element with the sheriff that was really fascinating to me within the story because you have the law is always manifest as a character in classic westerns and specifically in spaghetti westerns, but this one you actually develop an interesting triangle within the narrative of you've
Mm-hmm.
got Loco as the antagonist, you've got Silence as the protagonist, and then you've got Burnett as like the law here, and their interplay is really interesting. But then actually maybe it's more of a square, which isn't quite as interesting as a triangle when you're talking about narratives, because you also have Polycott, who up till this point is basically the law in the town in Snow Hill. And I find it interesting the way you worded it just now, where you were saying how like everybody is still respectful of the law, but the law, but it's also because the law allows outlaws to make a living because within the law they can just kill people for money.
And Polycott can outlaw and exploit as he wishes,
Right.
and then and basically yeah, and like I was saying earlier, like the sheriff represents the part of the state that is attempting to keep that under control, and you look at how ineffectual it is.
But there's a form of like abidance to a law in the town before the new sheriff even arrives.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess you're saying Polycott is sort of like the stand-in for the law because he is just as the it's like he is a mechanism of the law even before there's actually a sheriff there. But then you can see even when the coach arrives, you've got Polycott, you've got Burnett, you've got Loco, and you've got Silence. Well, Silence isn't really part of it. He just heads right over to Pauline's house right away because doesn't give a shit about these other guys that are here. But you have this interesting. Okay, so there's your triangle. You've got Polycott, you've got Burnett, and you've got Loco discussing once they arrive in Snow Hill, discussing the bounties that Loco needs to be paid for because he arrives with three corpses.
Mm.
And so you've got the justice of the peace, you've got Polycott who's got to pay him out in front of the sheriff, also with Loco there. And they have this really interesting discussion of like the importance of the law and what it means to be legal and how that needs to be upheld. It's so that's the interesting kind of three-way triangle dynamic that's going on in that scene because Polycott mentions that he's paying out Loco in front of the new sheriff, so everything's legal. Again, showing that this murder is legal. These corpses are commodity that's valuable within this society, within Snow Hill here. But then he mentions that he's paying for four corpses, and Burnett then as the new sheriff gets to exercise a little bit of agency, a little bit of power here. So he grabs all of the money and he's like, I don't see four corpses, there's only three here. And they're like, oh well, there's this like I think he says like, oh, there's this dead Negro over here buried in the snow. And then Burnett's like, well, I need to investigate, so I'm going to hold your money into like he's exercising his own form of power as the new sheriff, kind of announcing like, okay, well, I'm actually the authority in this town. Like he's kind of taking that away from Polycott, which in a lesser movie I think would just set up a dynamic where like, oh, Polycott's like, well, I gotta get the sheriff out of here. But Polycott actually kind of plays it cool and is like, well, I'm gonna play along with this. I don't care if this guy gets his money or not. And Loco isn't a hothead, so he doesn't immediately want to like just kill the sheriff or anything.
The problem is, yeah, if you did that publicly, there would be consequences.
Right. And the end of that scene is because they've been talking about according to the law. The end of that scene is like, well, like you said, everything according to the law. And you're like, oh my God, this is so cold.
Yeah. I mean, that's just it. Is you're seeing the different sides of the state in the terms of
Yeah.
Polycott and the sheriff. You're seeing the ways that power exercises itself within like the law and this. Yeah, I mean, it's a much more sophisticated analysis, right,
Yeah. Yeah. I think so too.
of the intertwining of law, state, and violence.
But not in a, it's not in a forced, overtly political narrative way. It's just how this world works. And you go with it in this movie because he is an effective world builder through characters and motivate. Like none of it feels, what's the term? Like none of it feels force fed in this. Like you could watch this entire movie and just enjoy it as a bleak in the snow, awesome Western, and potentially just all the political angles to it would just go right over your head or just like, wash right over you because it has enough of the beats and basic tropes of a Western. But if you really pay attention, you dig into it, it's actually subverting a lot of these things.
Yeah. Well, it is subverting all of these things. And right, it's got all the different chess pieces of a normal Western.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I mean, just to sort of sum up sort of the arguments about the law and the state, or not sum it up, but is this is these are privatized justice. Polycott and Tegrero represent sort of the capitalization and the complete privatization of both the functions of the state and of the law,
Yeah.
and the sort
Yeah.
of the vampiric harvesting of these sort of state capacities for violence purely for profit.
Oh, that is a good phrase. Sorry.
Thanks. It's and it's a very powerful metaphor for for the world that we live in. I mean, certainly for that the world that killed Che Guevara and the world that produced Italian fascism. But
Yeah.
in a very different way, it's one that we can recognize very much when old people are dying from being frozen because power grids are shut down, so that publicly supported private utilities can avoid doing weatherization because it would cost them more money.
Right.
It may not be with guns, but they're still living off of people's deaths.
It's not a cinematic, but that's the real world.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
this is also the real world sometimes too.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's not overtly mentioned. Like that's not everything you were just saying. Like that's not dialogue from a character telling you like, oh, you politically represent. Like it's just it's not ham-fisted that way. It's just it's all there if you want to dig into it and if you want to think about it and kind of like mull it over and be like, wait, what does that represent? What is that? And I really hadn't thought about it the way you just described it because Polycott. How do we describe this? Like if he was different, if the different things that he covers as far as being a character in this town. Like we said, he's the banker, he's the general store owner, he's the justice of the peace, he's the one putting bounties out. If those were all separate characters, I think it would be more politically overt because you could have like your mustache twirling, I apply bounties to whoever I want, I control the town villain. He's just this like by putting it all into one character, I think it allows it to I don't know, it feels more sinister and it also doesn't feel as overtly political, but everything you just described is there and it's all in one character, but it's really subtle the way that it's portrayed.
Yeah, it is,
Yeah.
which is not something the spaghetti western genre is known for.
Oh, subtlety? You say.
And yet, I think even there is a scene early on, one of the most striking scenes, in which Tegrero Loco, take your pick, is literally dragging one of his bounties along by a whip from a horse.
Well, he
Well,
lassos him, doesn't he?
he lassos him and is dragging him
Yeah.
on the ground to get information. And yet I would say that this movie is underplayed by spaghetti western standards.
Yeah, no, it really is. That's yeah, it is. It is while it isn't. I think that's the stroke of a master there, in my opinion. Well, as you're mentioning, like it hits certain beats and it doesn't hit other beats. So kind of like within the genre of spaghetti westerns, by 68 there's some tropes that are established. Also, there's just tropes of westerns that are established as well. And we already mentioned there's the whole thing of like, westerns are like a Hollywood thing because it's such a specific North American genre. It's like, well, yeah, but the Italians were doing it a lot better at this point in time anyway. So the standard tropes that exist within the genre that I think are worth acknowledging because this movie is subverting them at nearly every turn. So the tropes of the Western genre specifically are usually like it's the story of a lone male stranger rides into a town, usually a troubled town, cleans it up, wins the respect of the townsfolk, maybe takes out the sheriff as that's a source of corruption, or bandits or rebels or whatever. And at the same time, usually falls in love with a woman, whether it's a woman who's working at the brothel, who runs the school, who's the lone leftover survivor of like a local ranch family who's been there for, whatever. So there's always some sort of love interest there. And Great Silence has a certain number of those tropes, which I think is a very smart calculation from the point of view of writing this story, because you want to have a few things that feel familiar to folks that like the genre in order to successfully end up subverting a lot of the tropes. So Silence is a dude. So you got the lone male stranger. He's almost entirely dressed in black, which is, usually around in the Westerns for the heroes. He has basically a superhuman accuracy with a firearm. That's always important. And he has kind of that anti-hero vibe about him because he is operating outside the law. He isn't the new sheriff in town. It could have been written where he's the new sheriff. Like that could have been, maybe it was an early version of the story. I don't know. But like he's not the new official law enforcement apparatus in the town. And he technically does win the love of a woman within the story. But more often than not, what the Great Silence is doing is subverting a lot of these scenes. So you've got it's set in the snow. It's not set in the desert or the Great Plains or anything like that. Silence is amazing with the gun, but the little twist that Corbucci puts on this one is that I had to look this up because I don't know guns, but he uses a semi-automatic Mauser, which is not standard for Westerns. Westerns is a 6-shooter, 6-notch, that's all you got. He has a semi-automatic gun, so he's even quicker. He's quick on the draw, but he's also can shoot quicker too.
They say in the movie it's not as fast a draw, but maybe it's a faster shooter.
Faster shoot, yeah.
So part of it is it just shows how good he is because he can still outdraw everybody with that gun.
Right. And then, like we mentioned before, with like the ending, by the end, the hero's not only defeated, he's actually even stripped of this weapon, his Mauser. So, like, there's like a symbolic castration that Loco Tigrero has by going over. Once he kills the hero, he takes the gun, he snatches the gun away from him. So his weapon of choice is no longer with him at all. So even in death, he's got one final humiliation that revisited upon him. But I think one of the most subversive act that this film has is that it puts Pauline, a female character, front and center, with agency in this film. And I think I referenced it earlier. Like, to me, she's the narrative engine of this movie. Without her role in this movie, you don't have her soliciting Silence for, that might be not the right word. You don't have her asking Silence to seek to exact revenge for the killing of her husband. That propels this entire narrative forward eventually to Silence's doom and her doom as well. And that's not exactly maybe not necessarily revolutionary within Westerns, but usually within Westerns, as a female character, she would normally be working at the brothel as a whore, which elicits visual pleasure for the heterosexual males watching it. Or she could be the Madonna figure, the goodness that's the only goodness left in this town is her. And she eschews both of those labels.
I think I had not even thought of this angle, but I think you're completely correct. I think that is, yeah, I think her character and the agency that she shows and the complexity that she shows. Mm-hmm. And I actually want to talk a little bit about her and Silence's relationship to get some of that out, which of course,
sure,
this is an interracial relationship, which is still a big deal.
Oh, right. And also, this is not a white woman character. That's the other part of the subversion. Sorry, I forgot about that part.
So this is a black woman in a Western.
Right.
You would not
in
see
68.
this. In 68, you will never see this in an American Western until blaxploitation westerns in the 70s. That is the only way this could happen, and it would not happen in a movie starring white people.
Mm-mm.
So that, but also, yeah, like you're saying, the complexity of her character and her as a driving force.
Right.
So there's a scene that I just rewatched before this where Silence is staying at her house while she tries to get together the funds to hire
To
him.
pay him. Yeah.
And they both go to bed, and he goes to the second floor. I mean, this is like this small cabin thing with like a second floor, but everything's open. Like they can all see each other. They can both see each
Right.
other. This is the first moment of aesthetics. We should come back to the aesthetics and the music, of course, because like it's Morricone and
It's
blah blah
Morricone. Yeah, you got to talk about it.
But also just the visual. We need to really talk about the visuals here. But like, this is the scene where, I mean, this is a haunting movie, right? This is a ghost. I don't know. It is a haunting movie. It's one of the reviews I was reading pointed that out. I was like, yeah, that's a good phrase for it. But this is a scene where when you combine the music and they're just sort of, they glance at each other, like they're clearly attracted to each other. There's a scene where you can
Mm-hmm.
sort of see her putting on a robe, and then they go to bed with one on one floor, one on the other, and the music sort of is both, because only Morricone could do this, where you both feel the isolation and the tension, right? It's just this incredible scene where you just feel everything that they're feeling, the loneliness and the
Mm-hmm.
isolation at the same time of being in the same room,
Right.
and the loss that both of them have had.
It's funny you mentioned loss right there because what ends up happening is you think he's drifting off to sleep and he looks at a candle, and that's one of the two flashbacks you get in the scene, and it goes back to the loss of his parents and also the loss literally of his voice.
Where we also find out that Polycott was partially behind
Right.
that, and then also shot off Polycott's thumb, which is why Polycott actually hates him.
Right.
But eventually what happens is she can't get together the money. She offers to pay with sex.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really going on, I think this is clear in the movie, right?
And
I
he
think
walks right out like he's not interested in that.
he's not interested in that.
Yeah.
He's going to
I
do
mean,
this
he's
anyway.
interested, but he doesn't want it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
But part of what's actually going on there is, I mean, she's clearly attracted to him. She's clearly lonely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the way that that's handled, as you see these two people who in their various ways, like he's basically, the reason Silence can't speak is because the bounty killers who killed his father cut his throat so he couldn't speak as a child to
Yep.
prevent him from, right. So he's got his issues, right? I mean, that is why,
A couple. Yeah.
that's why he does what he does. Um,
Yeah.
but when they finally hook up, it feels it feels cathartic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It feels
Yeah.
like these two people who have actually found each other in a world that is deeply isolating,
Uh-huh.
and I think that the isolation comes through all of these shots of horses and people going through snowy valleys with nothing but the vast expanse of mountains around them, right? I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
a gorgeous movie, and you see it all throughout. And I think even without knowing the end, and certainly once you know the end, that sense of danger, both danger to every character in the film and sense of isolation, just pervades the whole thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it
but I
really
feel like
does.
that scene brought that home for me, like what's being done tonally here. It's just, oh,
Well, it's also, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's also like one of the few moments of human connection
yeah,
between, not just between those two characters, but that it's one of the few like human moments of the, I mean, in a positive like positive human moments in the movie.
positive human moments, right?
Yeah, and it's just so like fuck, like there's no end to this, is there? Like it's actually like a moment of like tenderness and connection and the stuff that you live for as a human. I mean,
Yeah,
aside from like just the basic survival that everybody else is like, desperate for, like it's just one of those few moments, which is interesting because also that moment is visually the way they do it is there's like these, like I said, there's a candle used for the flashback. Like Silence is like looking at a candle that reminds him of the time when he was young. He was looking at a candle when the outlaws came and killed his dad, killed his mom, slit his throat, took his voice away. That it's around like the warmth of fire visually in that scene is interesting.
yeah. There's a lot.
Ooh, the chills. I can feel it. Well, also like again, because like it's such a bleak movie, like those moments of like, well, again that, and then when they actually do have sex and they do make love, that those tender moments are the ones that you do kind of latch onto because you're a human watching this and going like, oh my God, finally like someone has a moment of like affection or happiness or warmth or tenderness or connection at all. Like, oh, good, there's a little bit of this.
Well, I mean, actually, in a very different and less, less deep or powerful way, is the Madame Regina flirting
Oh, with Burnett,
with
the
Burnett,
sheriff, yeah,
Burnett the sheriff, which they're totally innocent, right?
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it's kind of adorable, and that's the other reason why this ending is does what it does.
Well, that scene tonally too was very interesting the first time watching it because it's at the point when Silence has tried to provoke Loco, as we mentioned before, while he was playing poker, and Loco takes off his gun. He's like, I know the game. I'm not going to be tempted to do this. And then he beats up, fist fights Silence right at the moment when he's going to try to he is going to grab his gun and shoot Silence. That's when Burnett the sheriff steps in, he arrests Loco, throws him in jail, and then Regina comes with the money that Loco had won in the saloon, in the brothel. It's like, oh, here's his money, I figured whatever. And I was like, oh wait, there is a whole world of characters outside of the main ones we've been following that are going to exist in this town. We know the ending because we've seen it before, or even if you haven't, you've heard it by now from us. She's establishing a relationship with a sheriff, and also it's interesting because she's the character who, when the stagecoach arrives, she gets all the well. So she's the madam of the brothel, so she needs to. But she's like, "Oh, hey, ladies, the stagecoach is here." So they're all excited because there might be money coming in. There might be
Mm.
customers, and as the local madam, you would probably want to have a decent relationship with the sheriff and make sure you're at least playing ball or getting along or whatever. But it's more than that. When she arrives there, like you can tell, like there's a legit like flirting here. Where I was like, I would not mind like maybe 10 minutes of deleted scenes because I don't think it would. I think it would fuck up the flow of the movie. But I would love to see some scenes where like they went on a date or hung out or did something. Because they immediately do have between those two characters, between those two actors, there's like a little bit of a spark there in that scene.
Yeah. No, well, it's real chemistry.
It's real chemistry, yeah.
Yeah. Oh God, I thought you were going to say I could watch a whole romantic comedy about those two.
I mean, I wouldn't say no to a Netflix series made back in the day that's just like, 6 episodes of them like connect. Well, no, because it ends horribly. They're all dead.
Yeah, that's the
I don't want
problem.
to see that.
I don't want to. I don't even want to think about it.
I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle that.
So yeah, it's really the more you pick at this, the more depth there is.
There really
Um,
is. There really is. Well, you mentioned Morricone and the aesthetics and the visuals. What else your ear for the score here, because you told me about the score of this at the same time you were first telling me about this movie. And I played the score a few times as I was thinking about the movie, just cooking, cleaning around the house, whatever. And to me, it's not your standard. Well, you can't say standard Morricone score. He did like what, like 150 some scores. Like the guy was a
200,
score machine, or
200
200 was
something.
it? Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
200. Yeah, but like he was a score machine. Like,
Right.
but they don't feel. He has themes and he has certain styles that he liked, but he also has like wildly individual approaches, and he's not just like uh, he's not just churning them out without any thought or intent.
I was used to, like so many other people, if you start watching all of his movies, you know what his versatility is. He can do anything. And he's not lazy, right? Like
Right.
he's not resting on his laurels. The scores that he makes that he churned out fit the movies perfectly. And so if you're used to the good and the bad, the ugly score, which is of course one of the great movie scores of all time,
Right.
and you're expecting this, no, this is perfect for a quiet,
Yes.
a quiet, haunting western in the snow. And I think that's what it was. It was the first time I really listened to a really subtle score of his, and just the way that the way that he creates that atmosphere, that he invokes the snow with percussion. He does all these things. It's just awe inspiring,
It is.
and he creates that so much of that sense of danger that I was talking about, that sense of loneliness. It comes through that score. I I don't know. I'm not gonna say it's one of my favorites. I mean, no, I will say it's one of my favorites of his. I'm not going to say it's my favorite of his because that is pointless. Because who can choose?
Yeah.
But I think it was a reminder of it fits the movie like a glove, and it's nothing like any of his other Western scores I've heard.
Yeah, you're right. It fits, but it's not the well, you're dealing with an icon. And it's not one of those scores that's like it's not gonna be in the it wasn't in the highlight reel when he passed away recently.
Nope.
But it's perfect for what the film is, which is what the point of the score is. And
Right.
some of them, like because he's iconic, some of them did go beyond. Uh, they live beyond the life of the movie itself. Like you said, like the good, the bad, and the ugly. I could whistle that, and like my 10-year-old might recognize that. She's never seen a spaghetti western.
Hmm.
Like it's beyond the scope of just it's in the culture beyond the scope of just the movie. I just clicked on it real quick. 520 composer credits on IMDb from 1960 to 2020. Holy shit. Holy shit. But like you said, you if you watch some of the spaghetti westerns, and I think that's why he's a master. If you watch maybe like the Dollars trilogy, there are themes playing out throughout all of those that are recognizable to your ear. This one, as you listen to it, actually I can't really even speak to that because I went into the movie knowing he did the score because like the opening credits told me that. And so I was listening for it. And you're right though, like my first time through, I was like, oh, none of the music really stood out to me. I'm like, well, it doesn't need to. It's scoring the mood and the atmosphere of this particular story, and it does exactly what it needs to do.
It's funny. I mean, you mentioned auteur earlier. I'm less auteur. Well, I'm not. I'm actually not the biggest fan of auteur. Not because I don't think there are directors who are great
Ooh,
artists.
future episode maybe.
Oh yeah, let's do it. I mean, because I think it's always a collaboration, right? I don't think
It
it's an
is. It
accident
is.
this
Yeah.
is such a great movie with 5 writers, and I don't know who was responsible for all of these things. But and I'm sure Morricone always had a support network and all of these things, but obviously, like this is one of those cases where it's like you're just dealing with a genius.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think I think when it comes to directors, I mean, obviously they're great artists who are directors, but these things are complicated. You're and then it's the same editor every time and it's not an accident, right? But like you just yeah, Morricone is a genius. This is the
Yeah.
second time we've had a Gush episode right after he died. We also did that, which is when we covered Burn, which is one of my favorite Morricone scores.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think just if we could just talk about the aesthetics, you're better
Yeah.
at picking out the filmmaking than me. But yeah, I mean, this is a beautiful, beautiful movie.
Right.
And I really don't believe that's all shaving cream. It can't be.
No, it was not. I was reading some of the production stuff, and there was different things where they used to like fake snow at certain times, and I was like, yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes. The shaving cream thing just stuck out to me because I was like, oh, that's gross and weird, but also would kind of stick to you like, okay, fine, I'll go with it. The tricks you get with like Foley artists or cinematographer, like those are fun anecdotes. I dig it, but cinematography wise, though, it's interesting because Morricone is like the one guy that Corbucci was with as a collaborator. I mean, he has a lot of collaborators. I mean, you do that many movies over that length of a career, you're going to have certain collaborators. But this isn't like the way you'd have like Scorsese works with Thelma Schoonmaker since literally his first feature film. Like this isn't only the same editor. This isn't only the same cinematographer. But Silvano Ipliotti, I'm probably mispronouncing that, as a cinematographer on this one. He worked off and on with Corbucci. It wasn't completely with Corbucci the whole way through, but like he stuck around. He came back at the one I mentioned earlier from 1980, Superfuzz, with Ernest Borgnine and Terence Hill, where it's like a superhuman cop. I think that was one of the Miami ones. It's the same cinematographer as The Great Silence. I haven't seen that movie. It is available on Prime if people want to check it out. But like, I can't imagine it's as good as The Great Silence.
No.
Sometimes, the collaboration just it strikes gold. Sometimes it's just fine.
Right.
Great Silence is one of those where, they struck gold.
Yep. And then they
So,
melted it down and poured it on somebody's head.
right. I think we mentioned I don't remember if we mentioned it earlier or not, but Corbucci has a movie that he shot with Burt Reynolds called Navajo Joe where Burt Reynolds is playing a Native American,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but same cinematographer as Great Silence. So like again, it's off and on. I don't know if it was just within the industry, didn't have time to look, take a deep dive into all the collaborations, but again, Morricone's the big one. That's the one that's very front and center there. I know he was off and on with certain editors, with cinematographers, but like I said, I think it's just sometimes you strike gold, sometimes you're just fine.
Yeah.
So all that discussion, all that analysis, all that looking into the themes, the characters, what Corbucci's doing, what the actors are doing, what the narrative is doing, does it work as a politically charged allegory in someone who has very deeply felt political beliefs, interpreting what he's seen as the deaths of Che Guevara, Malcolm X, the 1968 revolutions, the uprisings, everything we talked about? I feel like he pretty successfully was processing a lot of things he was thinking about with this narrative.
So this is a movie. Yes, I agree. And I think, on first watching, there's things where it's like, I'm not sure why this is or this is, but then after watching a few more times, you realize, oh, this is all these reasons why these things are what they are. And it doesn't have to, allegory doesn't have to be this perfect whatever, right? Like, it doesn't have to be.
Right. Well, it's also allegory, like we said, because it's not overtly like this isn't like, oh, there's no character named Che or there's no character that says Malcolm. Like it's not overt. He's
Right.
he's dealing with emotions and themes, but perfectly tying them into a story that works within a specific genre.
I I think it does work at that level. I think, one of the things about movies like this, I actually have a list of movies like this. It's why I love noirs. Is that because this is a movie of him coping with political despair. Um,
Ooh,
this is a movie that can help you, as depressing and shocking as it is. It can help
yeah,
you to cope with despair
yes,
because it helps you to process because that's what he's
yeah.
doing. And I think that is one of the great powers of films like this.
Well, it's the power of good art.
It's the power of good art to deal with themes in ways to help us to sort of pull ourselves through it, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it gives humans the tools to process traumatic events.
right.
The good art does, I think. Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So, I think that it's interesting. I'm going to just connect this to our future, some of our future stuff. Or, well, I said noirs, I think, do that. I actually think we're just, our next episode is going to deal with eco apocalypse.
Hmm.
And I think some of those movies can do similar things.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to keep that in mind as we're watching these. Yeah.
So I think these are themes that we're contemplating because we're living in difficult times. And so I think despite as depressing as this is a movie for our times.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, that said, let's get into the release of this movie and the critical reaction. Because in doing some research for this, apparently there was an alternative ending known as the happy ending, where Loco draws his gun without waiting to be prompted by silence. Suddenly, Sheriff Burnett, somehow having survived falling into a frozen lake, rides into town on horseback, shoots Loco in the head, allowing Silence to kill the remaining bounty hunters. I'm not sure how, because one hand has been shot and one hand is burned to shit, and he can't. That's the whole point. Burnett then frees the outlaws as Pauline takes the bandages on Silence's burnt hand off, revealing a gauntlet that he's used for protection the whole time before applying bandages to his newly wounded left hand. As Burnett then takes the thieves to the local jail to await their amnesty, he asks Silence to become his deputy, which Silence accepts with a smile.
Wait,
Would
really?
that have helped process any of the
No.
It's ridiculous, right? Like, come on.
I mean, the gauntlet is a super spaghetti western shtick thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But
But
yeah,
we watched his hand get shoved in to the fight. Get like,
there's
no,
no
that
way.
happened.
Yeah, it happened, and there was no opportunity for him to do anything else.
No, no, no.
That sounds horrible,
It does
and
sound horrible.
you can't escape your problems.
That's one of those I think is. I mean, it may even be to a point of folklore. Like it wasn't a shot ending, as far as I know. It was like a written out alternative happy ending. I may be wrong on the shooting thing. I can't imagine they had the budget to like let's shoot a few endings because this is kind of bleak and blah blah. Like
I
no,
think there is a shot alternative happy ending.
really.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's that one though.
Okay. Well, that was when I came up in research where I was like, oh, you got to be shitting. Well, because the research was Daryl of Zanuck, who was at 20th Century at the time, he refused to release this movie only in the US. It was released in Italy and other places that 20th Century put out then, but it was like, we can't release this in America, blah, whatever. I was like, okay, well, thanks, idiot, but whatever. I did also find, as I was digging into that a little bit, just a quick little aside, costume designer for this, for The Great Silence, was heavily influenced by hippie fashion,
Hmm.
which this is one of those like wink, wink, nudge, nudge from Tarantino in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which has a fuckload of Corbucci references. I mean, at one point, Rick Dalton even goes to Italy to star in a bunch of Italian westerns and action pictures and everything else.
On this podcast, we've repeatedly pointed out the last 10 years of Tarantino's work has been a Corbucci
All Corbucci
homage.
reinterpretations. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I love it. It's great. But I just found it funny that the costume designer for this particular movie was heavily influenced by hippie fashion. Corbucci apparently was very known to be like, "Oh, I fucking hate hippies. I hate that whole subculture," and that influences throughout all of Once Upon a Time. So, just quick little side, but so Xanax said no to America. No, nobody in the U.S. gets to see this movie. They put it out in Italy. Didn't make a ton of money. Wasn't a huge hit the way like Django was. It didn't premiere in the UK until 1990, and when it did, it was on BBC Two. No shade on BBC Two, but I don't want my movie premiering on BBC Two. I want it on the big screen in a theater.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell? So I thought it'd be an interesting kind of little like thought experiment, real quick, as we wrap up. If this movie had come out, if this movie had been released in America, in the United States, in 1968, what would have been the cinematic theatrical experience environment in 1968? Couple titles I picked off just for fun, just for this thought experiment. Well, one we have to mention because we've already talked about it. One of our previous deep dive episodes, Uptight, 1968, wasn't a box office hit. Most people didn't see it, but whatever. It was, it came out.
Both of these are movies asking tough political questions and processing through tough political things, and both of them did really poorly.
I wonder if there's a trend there.
Mm.
From the Western point of view, you've got Hang 'em High that came out in 1968. Box office wise, though, let's take a look. You've got The Love Bug, the Herbie talking car movie, whatever. You've also got
You're just mean. You're being mean to. I'm just kidding. You can be mean to Kirby. I don't really care.
Herbie, not Kirby.
Well, that tells you something right there.
Right, no, I know. I mean, it's The Graduate, huge movie, 1968. You've also got Funny Girl. You've got Barbarella. You've got The Producers. You've got Planet of the Apes. You've got Bullet. You've got Rosemary's Baby. I would say politically of interest to note, completely counter to The Great Silence in 1968, The Green Berets. Yeah, enough said there. Like we said
uh,
before, fuck John Wayne. Targets, though. Targets, interesting. That came out that year. Faces, the Cassavetes movie. You've also got If, Lindsay Anderson's film. That came out in 1968. And as we mentioned previously, I think directly tied thematically to The Great Silence in a very interesting way, which we'll get into on some future shows, Night of the Living Dead.
mm-hmm.
So who's to say? I mean, we're kind of hypothesizing it wouldn't have worked when it came out, but you never know what's going to connect with people. Maybe the way that we talked about in our Uptight deep dive, the way that producers were hoping maybe that movie Uptight would connect with people, would connect with the counterculture, would connect with like revolutionary ideas and attitudes and themes, but it didn't at the box office. Maybe Great Silence would have. Maybe Uptight was maybe too overtly political, and this one would be in a bit more, again, like we said, it's weird to say for a spaghetti western, but subtly political.
Subtle. um,
Maybe it would have connected in a
I
way.
mean,
I don't know.
yeah, no, that's a really interesting question because, like, when you look at that, there's a lot of there's a lot of boundary pushers there, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But also in the realm of spaghetti westerns, like it's a couple years after Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There have been financial successes of spaghetti westerns, and if it's marketed right, you may be able to get some butts in seats. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it works so against the expectations though of spaghetti western watchers. You have to be. It's one of the things where you have to be very careful. Very careful about how you
How you recommend this movie?
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
like,
that's what I'm saying. Marketing is that trick of like we just need to trick people to get butts in seats. So you could put together a trailer for this movie that I think would appeal to spaghetti western fans.
but when they walk out, how angry will they be?
Well, that's the thing. Word of mouth would be just like fuck this movie, and then you tell all your friends that it's not the man with no name or anything. But yeah, I don't. I mean, it's a what if, but I think it's interesting. We're obviously looking back with historical perspective, so it's an interesting what if. How would this movie have placed in the lineup and in the sentiment? I mean, 68, as we said again, our summer 60s series, 68 is a fucking bonkers year
Mm-hmm.
of all kinds of different things. And I think it's interesting to think about how this movie would have fit in with that.
Yeah, it's I mean, the weird thing about all these, I mean, this is not a rediscovered movie 100%, but in many ways I mean, like Uptight, like Ganja and Hess,
Sure.
like Nothing But a Man,
Yeah.
and so many others. These are become canon after.
Right.
They don't have it. They reflect their times, and they are amazing, but they aren't. They don't have an impact when they come out, and that's a hard thing to navigate, because when they become part of your personal canon or how you understand film in that period, you have to
Right.
recognize that some of them are more influential than others, but like they're kind of not.
Well, I think like we said earlier, that speaks to the power of good art. It lasts beyond the moment at which it is created.
Yeah.
Let's focus on the great sounds, though. Awesome movie, masterpiece, potentially one of the greatest spaghetti westerns ever made, if not the greatest spaghetti western ever made. Everyone should see it. I can't believe it's free on YouTube. Go watch it. Please own the physical media. Get the Blu-ray. The colors pop. It's amazing. I've watched it three different ways. One was YouTube, one was Kanopy, one was the Blu-ray. I
I, I've
deplore everybody just to see it in some form, but
I think
please,
I might have watched it on YouTube at some point. I did see it in theaters just to rub it in one more time.
asshole, come on. Sorry.
Um,
I'm
and
just jealous of anybody talking about a theatrical experience right now.
I know it's really not fair. I
It's
mean, hey,
so bad.
I haven't
Yeah.
seen one in a while.
So Isaac, up next on the show, we've got something a little lighter, something a little more comedic, right?
No, no, no. It's time for us to really take on the darker themes of our times, which, of course, is something this podcast has never done before. Um,
Embrace the darkness. Let's just do it.
eh, but kind of. We're juxtaposing two films that deal with ecological crisis and humanity's relation to that.
Hmm.
Um, and I think I chose them both because one deals with the despair and one deals with the hope. And I think it's going to be interesting. And neither of these are movies you've seen, so I'm really looking forward to what you think.
Yeah, brand new
Um,
for both of these for me.
so we are watching No Blades of Grass by, oh shoot,
Oh, I didn't look this one up yet. I'm sorry.
it's the same guy who did Deep Red. I mean, the World War II, the movie we did during the '60s,
Oh, Beach Red?
Beach Red. Yeah,
Cornell Wild?
yeah. Oh, you didn't realize? Yeah, this is a Cornel Webb
Holy
movie.
cow! No. Oh my God, I'm infinitely more excited about this now.
Yeah, no, this is the other one where he does that weird
Oh,
experimental like thing. Except the thing
yes.
where he's showing future farther into the movie,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but he's not also in it. He does not star. Um,
That's good. I'm a fan when he's just directing, I think.
yeah. No, no. Oh yeah, no. This is Cornel Wilde. I'm putting Cornel Wilde up against
Yes.
Miyazaki.
In the patented out of left field Isaac double feature that makes sense once you watch it, but sounds bonkers when you just hear it.
Yes. So, I sort of gave it
I love
away. So
these. Okay. Yeah.
we're watching No Blades of Grass by Cornel Wilde. You can listen to, once again, in the summer of the '60s. We covered his Beach Red, which is not one
Hmm.
of his better efforts. He has made better movies, and I think this is one of them. But it is fucking weird. It is a 1970 eco-apocalypse film, and it is despair. And you know what? It's not unreasonable to despair over where we
Yeah.
are. But at the same time, we are also going to be comparing it to Hayao Miyazaki, maybe the greatest animation director alive in the world today. His masterpiece, Princess Mononoke, which is also a movie like many of his movies actually, with eco themes, but I think in his patented way, drawing out the hope in the face of despair. And both of these are movies that contemplate human and nature and their intertwinings. So I think it's going to be an interesting episode, I hope.
Interesting. We hadn't really talked to that through, I guess, because I didn't realize why you were pairing those two up. But I mean, eco apocalypse. We had in our notes. That's a theme we wanted to come back to and revisit several times in the life of the show. But so since I haven't watched either one of these, would you recommend a viewing order?
Nope.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Just curious. Just curious if you had that off the top of your head or not. But you said, one's bleak and one's hope. So based on what I said earlier about how to pair up The Great Silence and Mercenary, I'm going to do Hope first, which is Princess Mononoke, and then No Blade of Grass afterwards, because I like ending on the bleak for whatever reasons. Let's not think too deeply on that. While we don't think deeply on that, and before we sign off, be sure to rate and review the show in whatever podcast app you are using or listening to us currently. And if you do enjoy the show or have enjoyed a past show or enjoyed a certain theme we've discussed in the past, feel free to pass it on to a friend or two or three. We're also up and running on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all the usual social media apps. So give us a follow there and the links that are in the show notes on whatever app you're using right now to listen to our voices. Until next time, I am Aaron Spears.
And I am Isaac Miller. And stay safe out there.
Because you never know if there's a bounty on your head and there's a killer around the corner.
Yeah. Right.
Bounty law.
Yeah, or Klaus Kinski or whatever.